For the modern urban dweller, winter often brings to mind festive celebrations, skiing, hot coffee, and cozy evenings wrapped in blankets. We can afford to embrace winter because we have conquered it. Central heating, electric light, supermarkets, and warm transportation have turned the cold into mere discomfort rather than a threat. However, if we were to travel back 700 years to the 10th century in northern Russia, around Novgorod, Pskov, or Vladimir, we would see not anticipation of festivities in people's eyes, but a deep-seated anxiety. For a peasant in the Middle Ages, the arrival of winter signified the start of an annual siege. Nature, which had nourished them throughout the summer, transformed into a relentless enemy. Winter back then was not merely a season, it represented a small death for the world. The very space around them shrank. While summer was alive with activity in the fields, forests, rivers and markets, winter reduced the inhabited world to the confines of a single, soot-blackened hut. Everything beyond its walls became a realm of cold and darkness, where survival required special preparation. The 10th century was a unique period. Climate scientists refer to this time as the onset of the Little Ice Age. Following a relatively warm early Middle Ages, the climate in Europe and Russia began to deteriorate sharply. Winters grew longer, frosts became harsher, and summers turned rainier and shorter. Peasants had to battle the cold armed only with an axe, a wooden plough, and the wisdom of their ancestors. In October, this struggle began not with snowfall, but with mud. The autumn thaw transformed roads into impassable muck, isolating villages from one another. Yet, as the first frosts hit, the mud would freeze solid. This was the first warning. The gates were closing. The key marker in the folk calendar was the Feast of the Protection, celebrated around mid-October by the modern calendar. For peasants, this was not just a religious holiday, it was a strict climatic boundary. Proverbs of the time stated plainly, quote _0 _. It was believed that on this day, the earth should be blanketed in snow, like the Virgin Mary's shawl. If the snow fell, it was met with relief. A snowy cover protected winter crops from freezing. A black, snowless winter with severe frosts was more terrifying than any snowfall, as it could kill the future harvest while still in the ground. By this time, all fieldwork had to be completed. Any grain or flax left in the fields was considered lost. The entire month of October was consumed with frenzied preparations for winter. The primary task was to insulate the hut. Men would walk around the house inspecting every log in the structure. The chinks between the logs, filled with moss, could dry out and crumble, or birds might have taken them for their nests. Every crack needed to be recaulked. At the same time, they constructed a zavalinka. This was not just a bench around the house as we might picture from 19th century illustrations. In the 15th century, huts were often half buried or built low to the ground. A mound of earth or turf was piled along the lower logs and supported with boards. This earthen rampart served as an additional layer of insulation, protecting the floor from freezing. Without a zavalinka, icy drafts would sweep through the hut during severe frosts, making life unbearable even with a well-stoked stove. While the men focused on external defences, women prepared supplies. October was the month for cabbage harvesting. At that time, potatoes were unknown, and cabbage, turnips and bread formed the cornerstone of survival. Cabbage was chopped in vast quantities and fermented in barrels. This was not merely food, it was the primary source of vitamins that saved people from scurvy and gum disease. The pungent, sour smell of fermented cabbage would become a constant companion in the hut for the next 6 months. However, the most dramatic event of October was the slaughter of livestock. Peasant households could not feed all their animals through the winter. The hay harvested in summer was always in short supply. Therefore, only those animals necessary for breeding and spring ploughing were kept: a strong horse, a good cow, and a few sheep. The excess bulls, surplus sheep and pigs were slaughtered. This was a time of strange, frightening abundance. Normally, peasants ate meat infrequently, only during major celebrations. But in October, following the slaughter, there was an abundance of fresh meat. Some was consumed immediately during feasts to help build up fat reserves for the cold. The rest was salted, dried, or frozen if the frost allowed. Nothing was wasted. Blood, fat, and entrails were all put to use. The hides were immediately processed to ensure that warm coats or hats could be made before the frost set in. My name is Conver, you're watching Conver. Thanks for watching my content. I'd appreciate your subscription and like. Enjoy the video. Psychologically, this period marked a transition into a different state of being. The daylight hours rapidly diminished. In the 10th century, there was no notion of precise time, hours, or minutes. People lived by the sun, and as it began to rise later and set earlier, the rhythm of life slowed. With the darkness came fear. The forest, which had been a source of berries, mushrooms, and firewood in summer, turned into a hostile territory in winter. Wolves, gathering in packs, drew closer to the villages. In the twilight, any silhouette could seem threatening. People tried to avoid leaving their homes unless absolutely necessary. After sunset, doors were secured with thick bolts. The tiny wooden windows, cut into the logs, were tightly boarded up. Glass was not yet available. In wealthier homes, mica or animal bladders were used. But in a typical hut, windows were merely holes for smoke to escape and for ventilation, which were sealed tightly for winter. Inside the hut, a dim light prevailed. Illumination came only from the fire in the stove or from a splinter of wood placed in a special holder called a svetets. The splinter burned quickly, crackling and sending sparks into a basin of water. In such dim, unreliable light, people spent long evenings. By the end of October, preparations were complete. Granaries were filled with grain if the year had been good. Firewood was stacked in piles, hay was protected from moisture, and the hut was made ready. The family gathered inside. It was the moment when one realized that everything that could be done had been done. Now all that remained was to wait and preserve warmth. The first true snowfall, which settled and did not melt, changed everything. Sounds were muffled, the world turned black and white, and rivers froze, transforming from watery barriers into icy bridges. Life came to a standstill. A peasant, gazing at the snow-covered field, understood that for the next 5 or 6 months, their existence would depend on how well they had worked during the summer and fall. Errors in calculating supplies or careless sealing of the walls could cost the lives of the entire family. Winter did not forgive negligence. The door slammed shut. We are inside. If a modern engineer were to examine a peasant hut from the 10th century, they would likely find numerous violations of sanitary and building codes. Low ceilings, tiny windows, lack of ventilation in the modern sense, and cramped quarters. Yet, if that engineer found themselves in a northern forest in January, with temperatures below zero, they would realize that what seems like inconvenience to us was in fact the pinnacle of survival technology. This structure was not designed for comfort, leisurely strolls through rooms, or entertaining guests. Its sole purpose was to retain heat at all costs. In the 10th century, in the lands of Novgorod and Pskov, stone was hardly used for housing. Stone is cold, it draws heat away from the body, requires a vast amount of firewood to warm, and becomes covered in frost from the inside. Wood, on the other hand, is a living material. Even when cut down, it continues to function, breathing, absorbing excess moisture, and releasing it back when the air becomes dry. Most importantly, wood retains heat better than any brick. The preparation for building such a fortress began long before the first axe strike. Trees were chosen in winter, when the sap movement in the trunks had ceased. Primarily, pine or spruce was used. Pine, straight and resinous, rots less. Spruce retains heat better, but is more susceptible to moisture. Craftsmen sought trees deep in the forest, where the trunks reached for the light, growing straight like candles. The number one tool was the axe. Saws were already known in the 10th century, but they were categorically not used in wall construction. There is a simple physical explanation for this. In the construction of homes, the axe was the primary tool. Although saws were already known in the 10th century, they were not used for building walls. There's a straightforward physical reason for this. When a saw cuts wood, it tears the fibers apart, leaving them exposed to moisture and decay. Logs that have been sawed tend to darken and crumble quickly. In contrast, an axe compresses and seals the fibres of the wood, effectively sealing the end of the log. This treated wood could withstand the elements for centuries, resisting both rain and insects. Consequently, homes were not built, but rather hewn from the forest. The logs were fitted together so tightly that not even a knife blade could slip between them. However, wood does shrink, leading to inevitable gaps. This is where moss came into play. Harvested in large quantities from swamps, moss served as an ideal natural insulator. It doesn't rot, possesses antibacterial properties that kill fungi, and acts like a sponge. When it's damp outside, moss absorbs moisture, preventing it from entering the home. Conversely, in dry conditions, it releases moisture. Each log joint was packed with a thick layer of moss, a process known as mossing the hut. Without this, the house would simply become a drafty basket, exposed to the elements. By the 10th century, housing architecture was evolving. In warmer times, Slavs often lived in semi-subterranean dwellings, sinking into the ground up to the roof. However, as temperatures dropped and carpentry skills advanced, homes began to rise above ground. In northern regions, where the soil froze deeply and remained damp, houses were elevated on a platform. This platform, known as a podklet, served as a high basement area. It was not a living space, but a storage zone for supplies and tools, and sometimes housed small livestock during winter. The living quarters were situated high above the ground, accessible by stairs. This design addressed two issues. The floor in the living area did not touch the icy earth, and some warmth from the ground and animals below could rise into the home. The structure resembled a layered cake, with the living space securely insulated from the cold ground. The entrance to the living area was not just a simple door, but a complex system of vestibules. First, one would enter the seni, a cold entryway that blocked the frigid outdoor air from rushing into the warm interior. Only after passing through the seni could one open the door to the hut itself. Doors in the 10th century were engineering marvels. They were low and wide, constructed from thick planks. The threshold was made exceptionally high, sometimes reaching knee height, while the upper beam was kept low. To enter, one had to step over and bow down. This was not only a sign of respect for the hosts or the household spirit, although that was important, but also a matter of physics. A high threshold prevented the cold air from flowing in when the door was opened, while the low beam kept the warm air, which gathered near the ceiling, from escaping. Anyone entering would instinctively crouch, minimizing the opening's exposure. Windows in these huts were drastically different from what we are accustomed to today. Glass was rare and expensive, found only in noble houses or churches. In peasant huts of the 10th century, windows were referred to as __, quote, _6__. These were merely small openings in the logs, about 1 or 1.5 logs high. Inside they were covered with a wooden board called a quote, 7, which slid into grooves. During winter, these windows were nearly always shut, opened only briefly to release excess smoke when the stove was lit, or to let in scarce sunlight on a clear day. Gaps around the boards were often stuffed with rags or tow. The hut was perpetually dim, as light was considered a luxury that could be sacrificed for warmth. Losing heat through large windows would have been disastrous, so homes were designed with narrow slits, resembling the firing ports of a tank. The roof also played a crucial role in energy conservation. Nails were rarely used in construction, as iron was a costly commodity. Roofs were made from logs, with the gables gradually shortening towards the top. Longitudinal poles, known as quote, 8__, were laid across these logs, and roofing materials were placed on top. This was often quote, 9__, split boards, with birch bark layered underneath for waterproofing against melting snow. Heavy logs called quote, 10 were placed on top to secure the structure, often carved into the shape of a horse or bird at the ends. Snow was not removed from roofs in winter. Instead, a thick layer of snow acted as an additional insulator. Snow, composed of air, is excellent at retaining heat, effectively covering the house like a blanket. Inside, the living space was quite small by modern standards, typically ranging from 16 to 25 square meters. Within this area lived the entire family: grandparents, parents, children, sometimes up to 10 or 12 people. This closeness was a necessity. The less air there was to heat, the easier it was to warm it. The vast halls of European castles were frigid, where people slept in hats under fur blankets. In contrast, the Russian hut, small and cramped, allowed inhabitants to move around in just a shirt during winter. The floor in a 10th century hut varied. Wealthier homes featured wooden planks, split logs laid flat side up, while poorer huts, especially those without a podclit, had earthen floors. These were packed earth mixed with clay, which was cold, leading to life occurring not on the floor, but on benches and platforms elevated above the chilly air. All these elements, thick logs, moss, high thresholds, tiny windows, and snow-covered roofs, created a thermos-like effect. Heat loss was minimized. The walls absorbed warmth while the stove burned, slowly releasing it as the fire died down. However, no matter how well insulated, this structure only retained heat. It did not generate it. The fortress was built, the gates secured, and the gaps stuffed with moss, yet it was still cold inside, like a tomb. To transform this wooden box into a home, it needed a warm heart, and that heart was the stove. If a 21st century person were to enter a peasant hut of the 11th century during a heating session, they would likely panic and rush outside, thinking a fire had broken out, and they would be mistaken. What might appear to us as a disaster, thick smoke filling the living space, stinging eyes, and the smell of burning, was for our ancestors the only way to survive winter. We are accustomed to seeing white Russian stoves with chimneys in museums and films, adorned with rosy baked goods. However, this image belongs to much later times, the 15th or 16th century. In the 10th century, chimneys were non-existent. The vast majority of huts in Russia were heated, quote, 11, meaning they were smoky. The stove in such a hut was not a neat structure made of whitewashed brick. It was a massive, rough beast that occupied nearly a quarter of the entire living space. Most often, it was made of clay mixed with stones, or built from rough stone using clay mortar. Brick was too expensive and rare. The earthen stove was a monolith, pounded and compacted with wooden mallets in a mould until it became as hard as stone. Why didn't they build chimneys? Did our ancestors not understand how to vent smoke? They did understand, but a chimney was an unaffordable luxury in terms of heat. A direct chimney would allow up to half of the precious warmth to escape, along with the smoke. In the harsh winter conditions, and with the labour-intensive process of wood preparation, remember, they did not use saws. Every log was chopped with an axe. Wasting heat would have been madness. The stove operated as an ideal heat exchanger. Smoke, escaping from the stove's mouth, did not rise straight to the sky, but circulated throughout the hut. It rose to the ceiling, transferring heat to the walls and beams, and only after cooling did it descend and exit through a slightly open door or a special Volok window in the wall. Thus, not only the stove was heated, but the entire mass of the house as well. The walls warmed from within by the hot smoke. Living in such a hut required strict discipline and an understanding of physical laws. During heating, there existed an invisible yet clear boundary in the hut. Smoke accumulated under the ceiling in a thick, dense layer. Below, around human height or slightly lower, the air remained relatively clean and breathable. Therefore, no one stood upright during heating. People sat on benches, engaged in activities, bending low or stepping outside if the frost allowed. Standing tall during heating meant inhaling heated carbon monoxide and smoke. This could result in fainting or even death. During this time, children were either sent outside or made to lie on the floor, where the air was the cleanest, albeit the coldest. The walls and ceiling of such a hut were pitch black. Soot covered everything with a thick, velvety layer. For a modern person, this is dirt, but for someone from the Middle Ages, it was a beneficial coating. Soot is pure carbon, a powerful absorbent. It absorbed the odours of decay and sweat. More importantly, Smoke and soot contained phenols and acetic acid, which are natural antiseptics. In a smoky hut, wood did not rot for centuries. Wood-boring beetles could not thrive there, and mold and fungus perished instantly. Moreover, this natural disinfection helped protect people during epidemics. It is known that the air in smoky huts was nearly sterile, despite the outward appearance of unsanitary conditions. The smoked walls did not contaminate, but rather healed. However, the price for this was chronic eye and lung diseases. Trachoma and conjunctivitis were common ailments among Russian peasants. By old age, many became blind due to constant irritation from smoke. When the firewood burned down and the blue flames disappeared, signaling that the carbon monoxide had dissipated, the oven was closed tightly and the chimney or window was sealed. This marked the arrival of blissful warmth. The oven cooled down very slowly, acting as a life battery around which a rigid hierarchy of sleep formed. There were no beds in the hut. People slept wherever there was space and warmth. The most honoured and warmest spot was the oven itself, with its flat top serving as a sleeping area. Here the temperature remained the highest for the longest time. This place rightfully belonged to the elders, the head of the family, and his wife, as their old bones required warmth. It was also on the oven that the sick were treated. Heating was the primary remedy for colds and aches. Death on the oven is beautiful, they used to say, for dying in warmth was considered a blessing. Just below and to the side of the oven, under the ceiling, they built sleeping platforms, a wooden loft between the oven and the wall. It was also very warm there, sometimes even stifling. This was the children's space. Warm air rises, allowing them to sleep nearly undressed, even in bitter frost. Children grew up there, played, and listened to stories while gazing at the soot-covered ceiling. Healthy adult men and women slept below on benches nailed to the walls around the hut. These benches were wide, often carved with horse heads, and were covered with felt, furs, or simply coats for head support. It was cooler here than above. The floor was cold, and if it was -30 degrees outside, the walls exuded a frosty freshness, prompting people to sleep in their clothes, wrapped in fur coats. The coldest place was the floor. Sleeping on the floor was avoided. Drafts roamed there, and temperatures could drop to 5 to 7 degrees, even if it was 25 degrees by the oven. People only slept on the floor in extreme cases, such as when many guests or travellers filled the hut. Sleeping on the floor meant being at the bottom of the household's social hierarchy. The oven dictated the rhythm of the day. In the morning, it was stoked, and life awakened with the fire. In the evening, as it began to cool, life came to a standstill. Food could only be prepared in the oven. Bathing was done in the oven too. In large ovens, people would climb right in. Clothes were dried on the oven. But this enormous black mound of clay in the middle of the room provided warmth not just for people. In winter, the boundaries between the human and animal worlds blurred. When the frost became unbearable, those living outside were allowed into this sacred space. We often idealize the past, envisioning a peasant hut as a clean room with embroidered towels and bright floors. However, if we were to step into a northern hut from the 10th century in the midst of winter, the first thing that would hit our noses would be the heavy, thick smell of ammonia and manure. This odour was not a sign of the owner's sloppiness, but strangely enough, a scent of hope and life. In winter, the line between a human home and a barn for livestock nearly vanished. In a harsh climate, where temperatures lingered below -30 degrees for weeks, a typical shed or barn made from branches and clay would freeze through. Adult cows or horses, covered in winter fur, could withstand the cold by huddling together and breathing on each other. But the young, such as calves, lambs and piglets born in the fall or winter, were doomed to perish. Losing a calf meant losing a source of sustenance for the coming years, jeopardizing the entire family's survival. Thus, with the first serious cold, the hut transformed into an ark, sheltering all who might freeze. The most common solution in the north was a 2-level house structure. People lived on the second floor in a heated log cabin, while the lower level served as a winter barn. In the 10th century, the floors between levels were not made airtight or soundproof like today. Often they were simply thick planks fitted together. The warmth from the breath and bodies of the animals, cows, known to be powerful biological heaters, rose upward, warming the living area above. In the harshest frosts, this living heating from below added precious degrees to the hut, though often it was not enough. When the bitter cold struck, or when sheep began to lamb, animals were brought right into the living space with people. Imagine a room of about 20 square meters. It already housed 5 to 7 people, a grandfather, grandmother, father, mother, and 3 children. Half the space was taken up by a massive oven. And now, into this space, a newborn calf is brought in. They would create a special corner for it, called a quote 13 or quote 14, usually near the door or opposite the oven's mouth. They would lay down straw and place troughs with water. The calf became the center of the universe for several weeks. The children played with it as if it were a large dog, sleeping close to its warm side. Women nurtured it like an infant, sometimes even feeding it milk from a horn or cloth if the mother cow refused to nurse. Nearby, lambs might also be present. Sheep often gave birth at the end of winter, and the delicate lambs could not be left in the cold for even a moment. They were kept in baskets or boxes close to the warmth, sometimes even tucked under the benches where people slept. At night, the hut filled with sounds: bleating, mooing, the rustling of straw, and heavy breathing. Chickens held a special place in this menagerie. They are very sensitive to the cold. If a bird's comb or feet become frostbitten, it will stop laying eggs and may die. Therefore, chickens were almost always kept in the hut during winter. They were housed in special cages placed under the oven or in a corner. But often, chickens simply roamed around the hut, flying up onto the benches and even onto the oven in search of warmth. The unsanitary conditions were monstrous by modern standards. Chickens would defecate wherever they pleased. The calf or piglet needed to be cleaned up several times a day, with manure taken outside. The floors in the hut, even if wooden, had to be scraped frequently with knives and sprinkled with fresh sand or chopped straw to absorb moisture. The odour was so strong that an unaccustomed person might choke. But for a peasant in the 10th century, this smell was one of abundance. If the house smelled of manure, it meant there was livestock. If there was livestock, there would be milk, wool, meat, and draft power. In spring, an empty hut without the smell of animals was a sign of poverty and impending starvation. Moreover, the animals provided real, tangible warmth. The temperature in a peasant hut during winter rarely rose above 15 to 17 degrees. The floor was even colder, around 5 to 7 degrees. Every living creature is a source of heat, generating dozens or even hundreds of watts. 3 sheep, a calf, and a dozen chickens could warm the air in a small space just as effectively as a bundle of firewood. People and animals literally warmed each other with their bodies. Sometimes, during the fiercest snowstorms, when the wind blew warmth even from sealed walls, people would allow adult livestock into the hut at night, if the door permitted. A horse or cow could be brought into the hallway, which was also insulated, so that the animal's breath created a thermal barrier at the entrance to the living space. This close symbiosis changed the perception of animals. Livestock were not soulless resources. Animals were not just livestock, they were considered family members, companions, and fellow sufferers. People communicated with them, sharing news and stories. It was believed that the household spirits watched over the livestock just as they did over humans. To offend a domestic animal was to invite the wrath of the household spirits. In this close, warm environment, filled with the sounds of mooing and clucking, long winter months passed. Caring for the animals became the primary responsibility of women in the home, while men focused on repairing tools and equipment. The constant handling of manure and straw, along with the need to feed and water this large group in confined spaces, created an overwhelming sense of crowding. Personal space was virtually non-existent. One could always feel the elbow of a neighbour or the wet nose of a calf. Yet this closeness also provided a refuge from loneliness and despair. In a world cut off from the rest of the universe by snow, the presence of living beings brought a sense of fullness to life. However, feeding this expanded family was the #1 priority. The supplies gathered in autumn had to last until the first grass appeared. While the animals could survive on hay and straw, humans needed something more substantial to maintain their strength in the cold. When everyone was gathered, the pressing question arose. What would we eat for 6 months when the ground was as hard as stone and a new harvest felt like an eternity away? Imagine stepping into a modern supermarket, shelves overflowing with fresh vegetables, fruits, meat and milk year-round make us think of food as a source of pleasure. But for a 14th century peasant, winter food was a matter of survival. The equation was simple yet harsh. A limited number of calories stored in the barn and cellar versus 6 months of cold that drained energy from the body every second. If supplies ran out before the snow melted, the family faced starvation. The dominant scent in the winter hut was not that of firewood or smoke, but the thick, sour aroma of fermented cabbage. To a modern person it might seem unbearable, but for our ancestors it was the very essence of life. Bread was the foundation of their diet, but it was not the fluffy white loaf we know today. Wheat struggled to grow in the north and was considered a luxury reserved for festive pies. Daily bread was made from rye, dark, heavy, moist and slightly sour. This coarsely ground bread provided a long-lasting sense of fullness. A hard-working adult man could consume up to 1.5 kilograms of bread each day. Bread was not an accompaniment to meals, it was the meal itself. It was taken to the forest, crumbled into empty stews, and served as a comfort during long evenings. The second most important food was turnip. Potatoes were unknown in Russia during the 10th century, and their introduction was still centuries away. Turnips served as a substitute for everything. They stored well in pits until spring, retaining their firmness. They could be eaten raw, boiled, or steamed in the oven. The saying, "easier than boiled turnip," originated during this time. Turnips were simply tossed into a pot and placed in a cooling oven overnight. By morning, they became soft and sweet. Besides turnips, swede and radish also provided relief. The sharp and spicy radish, enjoyed with oil or kvass, was a delicacy on fasting days. But the most crucial strategic resource was cabbage. This is where the secret lies that allowed Russian peasants to avoid scurvy. In winter, without fresh fruits and greens, the human body rapidly loses vitamin C, leading to bleeding gums and tooth loss, along with weakness. Fermentation was the answer. Cabbage was not just salted. Salt was an expensive commodity, carefully conserved. Instead, cabbage was fermented. During the fermentation process, lactic acid was produced, which not only preserved the product, but also retained and sometimes increased its vitamin content. Fermented cabbage, along with its brine, was a powerful energy source. From this cabbage, they prepared shchi, a dish that in the 10th century was not a light soup, but a thick stew simmered for hours. The unique slow cooking technique involved placing a pot in the oven after the fire had gone out, but while the stones still radiated heat. The shchi did not boil, but slowly stewed as the temperature fell, resulting in a rich, dense flavour. Often this shchi was frozen into ice circles, serving as a precursor to soup cans. They could be taken on journeys. Just break off a piece of the icy mass, drop it into a pot of boiling water, and lunch was ready. What about meat? We often think that since peasants slaughtered livestock in October, they feasted on roasted hams all winter. This is a dangerous misconception. Meat was a festive food, and the everyday diet was nearly vegetarian, even in winter. Firstly, the church enforced a strict dietary calendar. Nearly half of the winter was designated for fasting. The Christmas fast was followed by a brief meat-eating period, then the Great Lent before Easter. During fasting days, meat, milk, eggs, and animal fats were strictly prohibited. Breaking the fast was considered a grave sin, potentially invoking divine wrath, not just on the individual, but on the entire village, often manifesting as poor harvests. Secondly, meat was reserved for physically demanding work. If men needed to go into the forest to gather firewood or logs, they were given lard or a piece of boiled beef. Women and children at home rarely saw meat. Their primary sources of protein were legumes, peas and lentils, along with fish if there was a nearby river. Fish was dried and salted in large quantities, cheaper than meat, and allowed on certain fasting days. What did our ancestors drink? Tea and coffee had not yet taken the world by storm. Water from wells or holes was unsafe unless boiled, so they mainly consumed weak alcoholic beverages or herbal infusions. The primary drink was kvass, not the sweet soda we know today, but a sour, thick beverage from double fermentation, sometimes flavoured with mint or horseradish. It quenched thirst and provided calories. There was also Spuyten, a hot drink made from water, honey and spicy herbs like St. John's wort, sage and thyme. Honey was the only available sweetener as sugar did not exist. However, honey was precious and saved for treating colds and special occasions. On ordinary days, they drank hot water with herbs or brewed leaves from berry bushes like currants or raspberries, which also helped prevent vitamin deficiency. In winter, the only berries available were those that could be stored without sugar, like cranberries and lingonberries. They were gathered from the marshes until the snow fell and stored in barrels of water as fermented berries. Thanks to natural preservatives like benzoic acid, they could last for months without spoiling. A handful of fermented lingonberries added to porridge was a burst of flavour in an otherwise monotonous diet. Day after day, it was porridge, bread, steamed turnips, sour shchi, porridge, bread, and turnips. In this cycle of flavours, any celebration with pies felt like a miracle. People looked forward to Christmas or Maslenitsa not just for the fun, but for the chance to indulge in something rich and fatty. However, even a stomach full of hot porridge did not guarantee survival. Calories provided internal warmth, but that warmth needed to be preserved. The moment one stepped outside, the frost began its assault. Here, the second line of defence came into play: clothing. A person in the 15th century did not know about synthetics, membranes or down jackets, but they knew how to dress to sleep on the snow without freezing. If you asked anyone to draw a Russian peasant in winter, their hand would instinctively depict someone in a fur coat and felt boots. This image has become so ingrained in our consciousness through fairy tales, paintings from the 10th century, and Soviet films that we consider it eternal. But this is a historical error. In the 10th century, there were no felt boots in Russia. Sturdy, felted wool boots were a much later invention, becoming common only in the 19th century. A person from the 15th century, stepping out into the cold in modern winter footwear, would likely lose their toes within a couple of hours. Their salvation lay in a completely different technology, which might seem primitive and unreliable to a modern urban dweller. We are talking about bast shoes. We tend to view bast shoes as a symbol of poverty and hopelessness. __quote _16__ is synonymous with backwardness. But in the winter forest at -30 degrees, a woven bast shoe, combined with proper wrappings, performed better than a leather boot. Leather is a fickle material. In extreme cold, leather stiffens, becoming as rigid as wood, and importantly, it conducts cold exceptionally well. If a foot inside a leather boot sweats and then cools down, it can lead to severe frostbite. Leather doesn't breathe, trapping moisture inside. In contrast, the lapati served merely as a framework, a sole with sides. The real star of the show was the anuchi, long strips of fabric used to wrap around the foot. The winter wrapping was a complex engineering feat. First, the foot was wrapped in soft linen cloth, which absorbed sweat. Over the linen, woolen strips of cloth were wound. Often, dry straw or a soaker was placed between the layers to create an additional air cushion. Ultimately, the foot was encased in a thick, soft cocoon. It was flexible and breathable, allowing moisture from the foot to pass through the fabric layers and either evaporate or freeze on the outer layer without chilling the skin. While this footwear may have appeared bulky, it allowed one to comfortably sleep in a snowdrift. Everything was secured with long ropes, or obor, which crisscrossed around the lower leg up to the knee, preventing the entire structure from falling apart. Of course, the wealthy, nobles and warriors, wore leather boots even in winter, but they rarely walked. They travelled on horseback or in sleds, keeping their legs warm under fur coverings. For a peasant needing to gather firewood in deep snow, choosing lapati was a decision rooted in both poverty and practicality. Above the lapati, clothing followed a principle that had remained unchanged for centuries: layering. There was no form-fitting thermal underwear, just loose-fitting garments that created layers of warm air. The foundation was a linen shirt, long enough to reach the knees for men and the ankles for women. Linen cools the body in summer, but oddly enough, in winter, it served as an excellent base layer beneath wool. Over the shirt, one would wear a zipun or kaftan made from coarse homespun cloth. The wool could be felted or woven, dense enough to repel water. Yet, the most crucial protection against the cold was the fur coat. In the 10th century, the term quote 17 did not imply luxury, it was a necessity. The most common type was sheepskin, raised specifically for its pelts. A peasant's fur coat was typically worn with the fur side in and the leather side out. The leather was uncoloured and unadorned, a yellowish white, greasy from age and dirt. These coats were heavy, with an adult man's winter outfit weighing between 10 to 15 kilograms. This weight slowed movement, making it impossible to run or make sudden motions. Sweat would accumulate quickly, and in winter, that could be dangerous. Thus, the Russian winter gait was a smooth, economical movement. An essential detail was the belt. Today we wear belts to hold up our pants, but in the past, the sash was the primary keeper of warmth. A wide woolen sash wrapped tightly around the waist several times ensured that clothing remained snug against the body, preventing cold winds from seeping in beneath the fur coat. Losing the belt was not just a breach of decorum, it posed a serious health risk. Without it, the fur coat would act like a bell, letting all warmth escape. The head is where a person loses a significant amount of heat, making hats mandatory. The most popular style was the triuch, a precursor to the modern ushanka. This hat featured 3 flaps, one at the back covering the neck, and 2 on the sides protecting the ears. They were made from sheepskin, fox, or rabbit fur. The neck remained exposed to the wind, as scarves in the modern sense were not worn. Instead, the high collar of the zipun, or a thick beard on men, provided warmth for the face and throat. Hands were kept warm in mittens. Peasants were unfamiliar with gloves, as fingers would freeze individually. Only mittens, knitted from wool or sewn from leather with the fur inside, were used. Often these mittens were quite long, designed to cover the sleeves of the kaftan, or they were attached with a string around the neck to prevent loss in the snow. Losing a mitten in the forest could cost a person their fingers. And what about children? In peasant families, many children had no winter clothing at all. A fur coat was a valuable item, tailored for adults and passed down through generations. Children grew too quickly, so during winter, they often became prisoners of the home. They might dash outside into the wind, wearing their father's long coat dragging in the snow, or their mother's shawl. However, lengthy snowball fights or sledding were out of the question. Winter outdoor games were reserved for teenagers, who had received some form of clothing or repurposed old garments. The little ones stayed indoors, gazing out at the icy window. Their clothing was like a second skin, rough, heavy, and smelling of sheepskin and smoke. It didn't just provide warmth, it preserved the body's heat. Even in the warmest fur coat, one could not remain outside in the freezing temperatures indefinitely. Daylight faded quickly. By 4 in the afternoon, dusk would settle, plunging the world into impenetrable darkness. All outdoor activities ceased. People returned to their homes, shaking the snow off their lapati in the entryway before stepping into the warmth. Ahead lay a long, endless evening. What to do when outside was a black void and sleep was still far off? This was the time when hands worked by touch and stories were woven by the tongue. In our modern world, we often complain about a lack of time, but for the Russian peasant in the 15th century, the main issue in winter wasn't a shortage of time, but rather an overwhelming abundance of it, compounded by darkness. In the regions of Novgorod or Pskov in December, the sun rose around 9 in the morning, but began to set by 3 in the afternoon. By 4, the world was enveloped in thick darkness. This meant that for a large part of the day, 16 to 18 hours, people were confined indoors, where visibility was nearly non-existent. There was no electricity. Kerosene lamps wouldn't be available for another 500 years. Candles were a luxury reserved for churches and nobility. Beeswax was one of Russia's primary export goods, sold by the ton to Europe. Using it in a simple home would have been wasteful to the point of madness. Tallow candles made from animal fat existed, but they produced a foul smell and were also costly, as fat was food. Therefore, the main, and often the only, source of light in a home was the luzhina. Luzhina was a thin, long splinter, usually made from birch or aspen. It wasn't simply broken off a log. The wood for luzhina was prepared in advance, steamed in the oven to soften it, then split with a knife and torn by hand into long strips. Good luzhina should burn evenly, without cracking or excessive smoke. However, even the best splinter would burn out in just a few minutes. A special tool called svitek was used for luzhina. This forged iron fork held the burning end of the splinter. The svitek was either stuck into the wooden wall or placed on a special stand, and beneath it, a basin or bowl of water was always placed to prevent fire hazards. The embers falling from the luzhina posed a significant threat to wooden homes. In a house with straw-covered floors and everywhere moss and tow drying, a single spark could destroy a family in minutes. Therefore, someone had to keep a constant watch over the luzhina. This duty typically fell to children or the oldest family members who could no longer perform heavy labour. They were referred to as __quote _0 __. The work was monotonous. Extinguish the burnt end, toss it into the water, light a new splinter from the previous flame, and insert it into the svitek. Hour after hour, evening after evening. In that meagre, flickering light, illuminating only a small area within a meter's radius, work continued. A winter evening was not a time for rest. It was a second shift. For women, winter was a season of textile labour. Everything that had grown in the fields during the summer had to be transformed into thread and fabric. In the 10th century, spinning wheels with pedals had not yet appeared in peasant homes. That invention would come later. Women spun using a spindle and distaff, a simple board to which they tied the flax or wool. This was an endless, hypnotic process. With her left hand, a woman would draw a thin thread from the fibre, while her right hand spun the spindle. Thread by thread, metre by metre. To clothe a family of 7, a woman had to sit at the spinning wheel every day from sunset until deep into the night. Girls were taught to spin from the age of 5 or 6. As she spun the spindle, thread by thread, metre by metre, the woman laboured each day from dusk until deep into the night to provide clothing for her family of 7. Girls were often set to work at the spindle from the age of 5 or 6. If a girl did not prepare a dowry before marriage, she was deemed either sickly or lazy. Meanwhile, the men occupied the male side of the house, closer to the door, engaged in their own essential tasks. They wove bast shoes, which wore out quickly, 10 days in winter and just 4 during the summer harvest. A family required hundreds of pairs each year. The men gathered bast, soaked it, and wove, and wove. Winter also became a time for repairs, crafting new axe handles, fixing yokes, and carving spoons and bowls. Amidst the crackling of kindling and the whir of spindles, a culture was born. Silence was a rarity in the home. To stave off madness from the monotony and darkness, people conversed. It was the winter evenings that preserved Russian folklore for us. Tales and epics in the 10th century were not merely bedtime stories for children. They served as an oral school, a library, and a television all in one. Storytellers were valued like gold. Through these tales, life lessons were passed down. How to behave in the forest, what to fear, and how to outsmart a powerful enemy. The epics about heroes functioned as news about politics and history, recounting events from Kiev or Novgorod 100 or 200 years prior, shaping the worldview of illiterate peasants. Sometimes, to save on kindling and warmth, they held spinning gatherings. Women and girls from several households would gather in one home. Working together was more enjoyable. They could sing songs that set the rhythm for spinning. Young men would come to watch the brides, share jokes, and listen to stories. These gatherings were rare moments of socialization, transforming hard labor into a semblance of celebration. Yet the romance of those evenings was often marred by physical discomfort. In the home, where the kindling burned and the stove blazed, the air grew heavy. Smoke stung the eyes, and soot settled on faces and clothes. The constant strain of working in dim light led to early blindness. Night blindness became a widespread issue. Furthermore, In the cramped, stuffy environment devoid of proper lighting, uninvited guests thrived: lice, fleas, and bedbugs. They inhabited the crevices of benches, the folds of clothing, and even hair. In winter, when washing was a monumental task and bathing a complicated procedure, the battle against these parasites became part of the evening routine. Searching for lice in one another's hair by the light of the kindling was a common act, a sign of care and kinship. By midnight, when their eyes could no longer see and their fingers ached from fatigue, they would cease their work. The kindling would be extinguished, plunging the home into complete darkness. People would lie down to sleep, preparing to rise again before dawn to continue the struggle for warmth and food. But before bed, everyone knew they needed to wash away the dirt and fatigue. For this, there existed a place that was both loved and feared. There is a common myth that the Middle Ages were an era of total filth, where people went for years without bathing. While there is some truth to this regarding 14th century Western Europe, where the culture of public baths declined due to plague epidemics and church prohibitions, the situation in the Russian north was fundamentally different. Here, the bathhouse was not a luxury or a place of debauchery, but the only means of survival. In a setting where 10 people lived in a cramped house with livestock for half the year, a lack of regular washing would lead to an epidemic that could wipe out a village in a matter of weeks. However, one should not envision the peasant bath of the 14th century as a modern spa with aromatic oils. It was a harsh, austere, and even dangerous place. Bathhouses were always built on the outskirts, by a river or lake, far from living quarters. The reason was simple: they were heated frequently and intensely, posing a significant fire risk. If a bathhouse caught fire, it was left to burn down to protect the other structures. It was a building of death. Inside, the bath of the 15th century was as dark as the home. There were no corpses, but smoke from the stove filled the space, heating the walls and killing any germs. When the stones turned red hot, the fire would be extinguished, the bath aired out from the smoke, doors closed, and water splashed onto the stones. The temperature inside could soar to 100 degrees Celsius or more. In this inferno, not only bacteria perished, but also humanity's primary foes, lice and nits. Soap, as we know it today, in solid, fragrant bars, was unknown to peasants. Instead, they used lye, a simple chemical accessible to all. Wood ash from the stove, preferably birch, was mixed with water and boiled or steeped. This produced a slippery liquid with a strong alkaline reaction. Lye effectively dissolved grease and dirt, but it was harsh. It dried the skin to the point of cracking and irritated the eyes. To wash away dirt, they used not sponges but brooms. A birch or oak broom at that time was not a massage tool, but rather a scrub. The steamed leaves acted as an abrasive, scraping off the dead skin along with the grime. However, washing the body was only half the battle. The main challenge lay in the clothing. Washing in the winter of the 10th century was a monumental task that fell on the shoulders of women. With no plumbing available, heating water in the bath for the entire family's laundry was a daunting task. Therefore, they washed in the ice hole. Imagine this process. A woman with a basket of heavy, dirty linen trudges to the river in 20-degree weather. She kneels at the edge of the ice hole, dipping her hands into the freezing water. The linen, once wet, becomes heavy and stiff like tin. It needs more than just rinsing, it must be beaten. For this, they used a heavy wooden mallet. The laundry was placed on the ice or on planks, and with force, they pounded it with the mallet, driving out dirt and parasites. The hands of these women turned red, became rough, and were covered in chilblains and festering sores from such labour. By old age, their finger joints would be so twisted that they could no longer hold a spoon. Thus, washing was infrequent, occurring every few weeks, with the goal of simply heating the clothes. Lice were the scourge of the time, found on everyone, from peasants to princes to monks. Crowded living conditions, sleeping in heaps on the same straw, and the inability to frequently change linens created ideal conditions for parasites. Lice carried typhus and trench fever. The fight against them was a matter of life and death. The primary weapon was the stove. Shirts and trousers were not washed every time. They were steamed, boiled in pots with lye in the stove, or simply heated in the dry clothes. Temperatures above 60 degrees Celsius killed the insects and their eggs. The comb used for nitpicking was the most personal item, carried on a belt and never shared. In the evenings, by the light of the kindling, searching for lice in one another's hair became a common activity, a form of social closeness akin to that of primates. If a woman searched through a man's hair, it signified they were close. After a bath, a steamed person would rush out into the cold. It is often said that diving into a snowbank is a Russian pastime. In reality, it was a hygienic necessity. After the intense heat of the black bath, the skin's pores were wide open. If one simply dressed and walked home in the cold, they could catch a chill as their clothes would become damp from lingering sweat. A sudden cooling in snow or icy water would instantly close the pores, halt perspiration, and create an effect akin to an icy armour. The skin burned, but the body retained its internal heat. Only after this could one don a clean shirt and dash back into the house. Yet the bath was not merely a place for washing. For a person in the 10th century, it was a liminal space. Here, dirt was washed away, children were born, because it was the cleanest place. Here, the elderly passed away, and it was believed that unclean spirits resided. The bath stood at the boundary between the human and the wild worlds. There were no icons in the bath. One could not enter with a cross around their neck, as it could heat up and burn. However, people interpreted this differently. In the bath, God could not see. The master here was the bath spirit, a malicious and dangerous entity. It was believed that he bathed after midnight in the fourth steam, and misfortune awaited anyone who dared to enter at that time. The bath spirit could scald to death, throw stones, or strip skin. This mystical fear of the cleanest place in the village paradoxically coexisted with necessity. People approached the bath as if facing a trial, seeking permission from the spirit's master. It was here, in the warm twilight of the bath, where the boundaries of reality blurred, that the most terrifying and mysterious winter rituals took place. As the darkest nights of the year arrived, the fear of the cold mingled with the fear of the unknown. In the dim light of the bathhouse, where the boundaries of reality blurred, the most terrifying and mysterious winter rituals unfolded. During the darkest nights of the year, the fear of the cold intertwined with the dread of the unknown. The bathhouse became a portal, a threshold through which nameless entities sought to enter the human realm. In darkness, the mind plays cruel tricks. The creaking of floorboards mimics footsteps, and shadows of trees take on human shapes. The modern individual might turn on the lights and laugh at these fears, but a peasant in the 15th century had no such luxury. For him, darkness was not merely the absence of light, it was the presence of something else. This other inhabited the cottage as densely as the living. The medieval person was never alone. They lived in a world teeming with invisible beings. By the 10th century, Christianity had firmly established itself in Russia. Every home had a red corner adorned with icons. People attended church and wore crosses. Yet as soon as the sun set and the howling winds began outside, a different set of ancient laws came into play. This phenomenon is referred to as dual faith, but for the peasant there was no contradiction. God ruled in heaven and in church, while local spirits governed the home, bathhouse and forest, and one had to negotiate with them in the here and now. The primary neighbour was, of course, the domovoi. He was not considered an evil spirit, provided one did not provoke him. He was the master, a grandfather figure, often viewed as the spirit of an ancestor, the founder of the family line. He resided behind the stove or in the cellar, his presence palpable. If something fell or crashed at night, or if an unseen weight pressed down on a sleeping person, it was not attributed to drafts or sleep paralysis. It was the domovoi, displeased about something. Relationships with the domovoi were built on a mutual understanding. You scratch my back, and I'll scratch yours. He was fed. On special days, or when livestock fell ill, the mistress would place a dish of milk, porridge, or a piece of bread sprinkled with salt behind the stove. If the offering disappeared by morning, supposedly eaten by cats or mice, it was seen as an acceptance of the sacrifice. If not, misfortune was expected. The domovoi could torment livestock, drive a horse to exhaustion at night, or tangle its mane into knots.
To prevent this, a chicken god, a stone with a natural hole, was hung in the stable, believed to ward off the spirit's wrath. But while the domovoi was a stern father figure, the Kikimora embodied nightmares and petty mischief. It was believed she lived in damp and dirty places, behind the stove or in the attic. Kikimora despised lazy women, but also troubled the industrious. If a mistress left a spinning wheel with unfinished fibre overnight without crossing herself, Kikimora would tangle the threads, tear the yarn, and ruin it. The sound of the spindle in the night's silence, when all were asleep, invoked terror. She was coming. Spotting a Kikimora was seen as an omen of death or great misfortune. This mystical world came alive during the darkest time of the year, around the winter solstice and the festive season. The festivities lasted 12 days, from Christmas to Epiphany. It was a time when the boundaries between worlds thinned to their breaking point. The old sun died, and the new one was born. And in this fracture of time, chaos broke into the human realm. For us, these festivities are about cheerful caroling and fortune-telling. For a person in the 10th century, it was a period of sacred fear and ritual madness. Caroling was not merely about collecting treats. Those in disguise, wearing inside-out fur coats, blackened faces, or frightening birch bark masks, did not represent humans. They embodied beings from beyond, ancestors, spirits. They were feared. The disguised often behaved aggressively, speaking not in human voices but mooing or humming, and could strike with a staff or frighten young women. They were given food and gifts not out of generosity, but to appease them. __quote_3___. This was no joke. It was a ritual threat. If offerings were not made to the spirits, the year would be one of famine. The most intense form of interaction with the other world was through fortune-telling. The church strictly prohibited it, labelling it as devilry. Yet on festive evenings, the fear of the future outweighed the fear of sin. Everyone participated, especially unmarried women. The question was always the same. Quote 4. The bathhouse was the most terrifying place for divination. Women would go there at night, removing their crosses and untying all knots in their clothing, letting their hair down. Knots obstructed energy, and the cross closed off communication. They gazed into water in a basin, listening to the silence. Any sound was interpreted as a sign. __quote_5__. The most daring would attempt to use a mirror for fortune-telling, if they could find one among wealthy neighbours, or would look into the reflection in the water by candlelight. To see one's betrothed in the mirror's corridor was a powerful psychological hallucination, triggered by fear, anticipation, and flickering light. Often girls would faint or fall into hysterics, but this adrenaline rush was essential. In a state of sensory deprivation, seeing the same faces and walls for months, the psyche needed a jolt. The festivities, with their horror, laughter, disguises, and divinations, acted as a pressure release valve. People acted out their fears in a playful manner. Terrifying masks made the invisible threat visible, and therefore conquerable. Everything culminated at Epiphany. People would head to the icy waters of the Jordan River to wash away the sins of the festive revelries, don their crosses once more, and restore order to the Christian way of life. Chaos retreated. However, while one could negotiate with spirits through a bowl of porridge or a prayer, the outside world prepared trials that could not be appeased. Beyond the threshold lay the winter road, and anyone daring to venture onto it risked encountering the Kikimora or facing a very real death, complete with fangs or a knife hidden in their clothing. Paradoxically, for a person in the 14th century, winter was not a time of isolation, but rather a season of maximum mobility. We tend to think that snow and frost confine people to their homes, yet in medieval Russia, summer was the season of impassable roads. There were no modern roads with solid surfaces, embankments or bridges. In summer, the land route was a narrow path winding between swamps and forests, full of roots, holes, and mud. Autumn and spring rains turned these paths into impenetrable bogs, where carts would get stuck to the hubs. Rivers were the main arteries, but navigating upstream was a grueling task. Winter changed everything.
Once the rivers froze and the swamps solidified, Russia became covered in a network of perfect, smooth highways. An icy river was a ready-made road, flat and wide, with no inclines or declines. Snow filled in the holes and debris, allowing what took weeks to traverse in summer to be covered in days during winter. Sledges were the primary mode of transport. The wheel was unreliable and complicated to make in peasant households of that time. In deep mud or loose snow, a wheel was useless. Sleds distributed the weight of the load, glided, and did not break. They were even used in summer on wet grass and marshy ground, but in winter they reigned supreme on the roads. Peasants awaited the winter sledding paths like a gift from heaven. It was during winter that significant trade began. Grain harvested in the fall, flax, furs, honey, and wax, all needed to be transported to fairs or paid as tribute to the prince and boyars. It was impossible to haul these on carts through mud, so caravans were formed in December and January. A caravan was a lifeline for survival. No one travelled alone in winter over long distances. It was akin to suicide. Peasants from one or several villages banded together, forming groups of 10, 20, or even 50 sleds. The greatest danger on the winter road was not the cold, but the wolves. In the 10th century, as the cold set in, these creatures became more aggressive. The forests stood close to the villages. Huge packs, driven by hunger, were unafraid to venture onto the road. A lone horse with a rider was easy prey for them. The wolves acted with tactical precision, cutting off the horse, pushing it into the snow, and a person who fell into a snowdrift while bundled in a heavy coat became helpless. The caravan provided a chance for defense. People armed themselves with pitchforks, heavy spears with crossbars, axes and torches. Fire was the only thing the beasts truly feared. They would camp right in the fields or woods if they could not reach an inn or village. Sleds were arranged in a circle, with the fronts facing outward. Horses were herded inside the circle, and a large fire was lit in the centre. This fiery fortress was guarded in shifts throughout the night. The glowing eyes of wolves lurking in the darkness beyond the circle of light were a familiar sight during these overnight stays. Another threat came from dangerous individuals. Bandits were drawn to winter roads, knowing that trade caravans were tempting targets. There was no security, police, or patrols on the roads. The prince's warriors only protected the prince himself or important envoys. Peasants had to fend for themselves. Skirmishes on the roads were brutal and often deadly. It was the law of the tiger, the stronger prevailed. If a caravan was attacked, men fought fiercely, for losing their horses and goods in winter meant condemning their families to starvation. But the most treacherous enemy was the blizzard. In the open fields, where there were no landmarks, a snowstorm could strike without warning. Visibility would drop to zero, and the road could be completely buried in half an hour. Getting lost in the 14th century meant certain death. There were no GPS devices or maps. Travellers relied on markers, branches, or poles stuck along the winter paths, or they listened for the sound of church bells if they were near a settlement. During a blizzard, the caravan would halt. Horses would turn their tails to the wind, while people burrowed into hay or beneath overturned sleds, waiting it out. They could wait for a day or two. If the storm lingered, people could freeze beneath the snow. Archaeologists and historians have uncovered evidence of entire caravans vanishing into the snowy haze, becoming the first flowers of spring that were only discovered months later. Trade, firewood delivery, trips to town for court or church, all of this happened in winter. The winter road was the lifeblood of the country. It connected distant lands and facilitated the exchange of news and goods. The merchants and traders from Novgorod embarked on their longest journeys in winter, travelling on skis and sleds to hunt for furs in the Urals. But this freedom of movement ended with the last snow. In March, the roads would collapse and the ice on rivers darkened and became fragile. Crossing became perilously dangerous. Sleds could plunge into a hole in the ice along with the horse and rider. Once the road turned to mud, the world shrank back to the size of one's own village. By March, peasants returned home. The outside world became inaccessible again. Caravans were unhitched and sleds were put away. The most dreadful time of year began. a time when wolves were not as fearsome as what awaited inside one's own home. Supplies that had seemed endless in autumn began to dwindle. There exists a great illusion that the harshest time of year is the bitter midwinter with its biting frosts and blizzards. In reality, January and February were relatively peaceful and bountiful for a peasant in the 10th century. The granaries were not yet empty, meat from the autumn slaughter was still available, and firewood was abundant. The true horror arrived when the sun began to warm and the days grew longer. March and April were the real killers of the medieval period. By early spring, the supplies that had been calculated in autumn were running out, and the harsh arithmetic came into play. Grain was divided into two unequal piles. The smaller one was what could be eaten. The larger one was the seed stock. This grain was sacred and untouchable. It could not be disturbed, even if children were starving or an elderly father was dying. Eating the seed grain meant signing a death warrant for the entire family the following year. It was a choice between possible death now and guaranteed doom later. Thus, the peasant, gritting his teeth, chose the future, guarding the bags of seed like the greatest treasure. By March, bread ceased to be bread. Flour ran out. To prolong survival, housewives began baking substitutes. In the dough, if one could even call that grey mass dough, they added anything that could provide bulk. The first ingredient was lamb's quarters. The seeds of this weed were collected and dried in the autumn for a rainy day. Lamb's quarters had no flavour. It merely filled the stomach, tricking the sense of hunger. But lamb's quarters ran out quickly. Then they turned to pine inner bark, the soft layer of wood beneath the bark. It was scraped from trees, dried by the stove, ground to powder, and mixed with the remnants of rye flour. This bread was bitter as wormwood, hard as stone, and scratched the throat. It caused stomach aches and constipation, but it provided some weight inside. In the hungriest years, bread was mixed with dried moss, crushed straw, and even clay, just to have something to swallow. The thick, hearty cabbage soup of winter turned into a watery broth by spring. In the pot floated a few leaves of pickled cabbage and water, not a speck of fat or a piece of meat. This concoction was referred to as water with cabbage. It contained just enough calories to keep one from collapsing, but not enough to work. It was during this time that Lent began. The church calendar remarkably aligned with the rhythms of peasant life. Lent forbade meat, milk, eggs, and fish precisely when they were physically no longer available. Cows, worn out from a long winter in cramped barns, stopped giving milk to conserve energy for calving. Hens, sensing the lack of light and feed, ceased to lay eggs. Lent was not a burden on the body. It was a recognition of inevitability. Religion urged, endure and humble the flesh. This helped people endure hunger not as humiliation, but as a spiritual feat. The physical condition of people changed. By March, all movements became sluggish. Energy conservation reached a biological level. The atmosphere grew quieter. Children stopped running and shouting. They spent more time sitting on benches or lying down, staring into space. Adults spoke little and softly. Faces took on a sallow hue. Eyes sunk in. Immunity, weakened by 6 months without sunlight and vitamins, crumbled. Scurvy, which had been held at bay during winter by pickled cabbage and pine needles, surged in spring. Gums bled, teeth loosened, and old wounds reopened. Any cold caught in a draught quickly escalated into pneumonia or tuberculosis. In the 14th century, there were no antibiotics. The body, deprived of protein, could not fight infection. March and April marked the peak of mortality. The weakest, the elderly and infants, perished. Breast milk from exhausted mothers dwindled or became as thin as water. Infants were fed gruel, chewed bread wrapped in cloth. But the bread mixed with bark or weeds was rejected by the delicate stomachs of babies. Spring funerals became as commonplace as icicles melting from roofs. Livestock suffered too. By spring, feed in the barn ran out. Even the poorest hay was consumed down to the last blade.
Straw from roofs and old structures was fed to the animals. Cows and horses became mere skin stretched over bones. Sometimes, an animal could not stand due to weakness. They were hoisted up, wide cloths or ropes tied beneath their bellies and suspended from the ceiling beams to prevent them from lying flat and developing sores. A farmer might go without food, but he would always give the last morsel to his horse. For without a horse, spring ploughing could not begin, and that meant hunger for everyone the following year. Psychologically, this was a time of deep despair. The winter road collapsed, turning into a muddy mire. The cabin found itself isolated once more. The smells in the home changed. The scent of smoke and damp clothing mingled with the heavy, sweet odour of hunger and illness. People awaited the first signs of life, not the sun, but the grass. The first sprouts of nettles, ground elder and sorrel were welcomed as salvation. They were eaten raw or cooked into green soups that tasted better than any meat. This was a signal. Death had retreated. If they made it to the grass, they would live. The appearance of bare patches in the fields signified not only the end of hunger, but also the beginning of grueling labour. Weak, wind-blown people had to step into the fields to plough the heavy, wet earth. Where did they find the strength? It remains a mystery of the human spirit. Perhaps the earth itself, awakening, bestowed energy upon them. March in the 10th century was not a month of spring as we understand it. It was a month of empty pots, children's cries and great endurance. It was the narrow neck of an hourglass through which life must seep to become wide and full again. And when in April the ice on the rivers cracked with a loud snap, it sounded like cannon fire in honour of the survivors. The first thaw in the 10th century resonated louder than any church bell. It was the sound that had been awaited for 180 days, the sound of silence being shattered. As the sun began to not just shine but to warm, the very physics of the space transformed. Snow, which had been as hard as rock for 6 months, creaked underfoot and suddenly became loose, heavy and grey. It settled, revealing the dirt, splinters and debris that had accumulated around the cottage. For the peasant, the arrival of spring was not a romantic awakening of nature, but rather a signal for an urgent evacuation from winter mode. The cottage, which had served as a fortress, turned into a damp trap come spring. The walls began to weep, condensation trickling down the logs. The earthen mound that had protected against the frost was now soaked with water, threatening to rot the lower logs of the structure. Thus, the first task for the men, once the snow melted, was to clear the dirt from the walls, allowing the wood to breathe. Inside the home, the scent changed. The heavy odour of smoke and sweat mingled with the smell of damp earth, decaying straw, and finally, fresh air. Windows that had been boarded up tightly were opened, wooden slats removed, and stuffing pulled out. The first rush of spring air in the cottage was intoxicating, like wine. After months of oxygen deprivation, people literally became giddy from the freshness. Yet the most dramatic moment of spring was the first release of the livestock. This usually occurred on the feast day of St. George, or the day of the Spring George. It was a significant and daunting day. Animals that had spent half a year in darkness and confinement often forgot how to walk. Cows wobbled from weakness, their legs buckling, while horses squinted against the bright sun, startled by their own shadows. This release was a ritual. The owner did not simply drive the livestock out with a stick. He took a branch of willow, blessed in church on Palm Sunday, and with it, like a magic wand, ushered the animals onto the first grass. It was believed that the willow would grant them the strength of the earth and protect them from wolves, who were particularly hungry and fierce in spring. If a cow survived but could not walk, it could be carried out or led on a sled, as long as it touched the living earth with its hooves. It was at this moment that the results of the winter were assessed. The statistics were harsh and unforgiving. The peasant would walk through his holdings, counting his losses. If chickens had perished, it was unfortunate but manageable. If sheep had frozen, it was bad news. The family would be without wool and warm clothing. But if a horse did not rise, that was a catastrophe. Without a horse, spring ploughing would be impossible. It meant that the man would have to harness himself to the plough alongside his wife and sons, straining to till even half the field. The death of a horse in spring often signified a slow decline for the family in the years to come. People emerged into the light transformed, pale, with translucent skin, so emaciated that their clothes hung loosely. Their eyes watered from the bright light. Yet the spring sun worked wonders. As soon as the first greenery appeared, the first sorrel and nettles, their bodies began to eagerly absorb life. Faces darkened from sun exposure almost instantly. Fragile skin burned after just one day of work in the fields. Psychologically, this moment marked a turning point. The winter depression, lethargy, and drowsiness vanished, replaced by a feverish energy. There was no time for reflection. One could not sit on a bench and say, "Oh Lord, how hard it was. We must work." The earth was awakening. For the peasant, it was a living entity. There was a strict prohibition. One could not touch the earth, plough, dig, or drive in stakes until it sang, meaning until it dried out and warmed up. To violate this prohibition was to insult Mother Earth, and she might withhold her harvest. Thus everyone waited, checking the soil with their hands. As soon as the earth became warm and crumbled in their grasp, the harvest season began. Winter tools, spinning wheels, looms and sleds were tucked away in distant corners, while ploughs, harrows and sickles were brought out. The wheel of time turned. Survival in a peasant's cottage in the 10th century was not the feat of a lone hero. It was a collective victory of the family. It was not the strongest who survived, but the most disciplined and united. Those who did not consume their seed grain, who did not hesitate to check on the calf at night, who shared their last piece of bread with a worker. Winter in Russia was a great equalizer and teacher. It taught patience, a virtue unknown to southern peoples. It taught planning 6 months ahead, knowing that a miscalculation could lead to death. It shaped the national character, the ability to endure, to coil like a spring, so that when the time came, one could uncoil and achieve the impossible. As the snow finally disappeared from the ravines and the rivers returned to their banks, the memory of the cold faded remarkably quickly. Human psychology is merciful. The horror of long nights, the hunger of March, the fear of wolves, all of it receded into the background, becoming just a tale. Ahead lay summer, a brief, hot, laborious northern summer. It had to be lived in such a way that when the next winter came and the gates closed again, the granary would be full of bread, the stove stocked with firewood, and the soul at peace. The circle was complete. You've been watching. Thanks for watching and have a great day.